I want to start by reading you an article, and you could let me know if these articles resonate with you in terms of how it affects us, in terms of how it affects our health, the environment. So I want to read you an article, and then you can give me your thoughts if you have any on it. This is an article from March 5th, 2015, from mangabay.com. This one says, humans cause erosion 100 times faster than normal. It says, experts have long linked deforestation and intensive farming to worsening erosion rates around the world. Although studies extensively determining erosion rates due to human-induced activities have rarely been quantified by scientists. However, new research conducted by geologists finds that erosion rates in the southeastern United States increased 100 times after the arrival of European colonists in the 1700s due to tree clearing and unsustainable agricultural practices. That's it. I'm not going to read the rest of you. You want to comment on that? Any thoughts on that?
Is this on? Oh, okay. I can start with that. I actually wrote a whole book about that subject. And I'm familiar with that study. I think it's right. It's spot on. The problem that many societies have had, and I'll be talking about this tomorrow at some length, so I'll try and keep it short tonight. But the basic problem with plow-based agriculture, what I like to call really conventional agriculture, before we had the conventional agriculture we call conventional agriculture now, plow-based agriculture was conventional in many parts of the world. And that caused erosion to race ahead of soil production in region after region. And the American Southeast is one of those areas where post-colonization erosion rates really went through the roof. And geologists have, there's been a number of studies through the years that have quantified this, but geologists have new tools now to actually put more solid numbers on those estimates. And the study you're referring to is sort of one of the latest examples of a really good case study that shows the degree to which sort of long-term slow soil loss at a pace that in any given year may be kind of hard to measure and recognize, something that would happen on the order of, say, 1 millimeter a year. I'll show you some further data tomorrow on that. But you let that run long enough and it can really add up. That happened in New England, it happened in the American Southeast. It actually shaped a lot of the early history and social evolution of this country. And if you go farther back in history, you can trace it to other countries. And I'll pick that up again tomorrow.
Hi, it's good to be back. Nice to be here. It's funny, I was just thinking about soil erosion and picturing, I have some statistical things to say and rational things to say, but I was just thinking, I used to live on the Mekong River, and the Mekong River looks like a latte, going by. It's just completely, it's this soil, I mean, I was just picturing how the rivers of the world just strip the land of soil and carry it out to sea, and there are natural processes, but when you mentioned, Stephen, the deforestation, that's one of the most egregious as well, and unsustainable agricultural practices. But my reaction to that is that it's a matter of scale. That what we're doing now with the rising population and declining land base is we're over practicing agriculture and over deforesting and doing it all in the wrong ways. And the reason for that is that we don't see, we're not taking into account the effect of what we're doing. We're not saying, we're saying we need these trees or we need this field to grow some food. This is very short-term thinking. So what I want to do tonight is, in my work as a writer, is to try and connect the dots and say, what are all the other aspects of the problem that we also need to be paying attention to? Because if we're just thinking about it in terms of what we're going to gain from the forest or gain from the field and not looking at how the runoff affects the rest of the material, then the world, then that's going to be, that short-term thinking is one of the systemic problems behind the kind of soil erosion we're getting. I'm a big fan of John Jevons. I don't know if you know John. And he taught me that it takes 500 years to grow 1 inch of soil. And he's big about growing soil. So I always tell my grandchildren when I garden with them, we're not just growing food, we're not just even making compost, we're growing soil. And I live in an area, a forested area, where I'm constantly putting out cover crops, even in the forest areas, and just constantly feeding them and feeding them. So we've talked a lot about the food system, and we forget about the food system of the earth, and that we need to refeed that 6 inches of life-giving soil that covers this planet. So we feed ourselves, but remember to also feed the earth, and what are the practices in your own life that you can do that? John Jevons also says that there's only 36 to 52 years of farmable soil left on the planet if we continue the practices we're doing today. So this is an urgent matter.
Well, as a physician, I would have said many years ago that this is either above my pay grade or out of my realm of understanding. But I did grow up on a farm, a 40-acre farm in southern Missouri that was trying to be self-subsistence, that we had everything that we needed kind of farming. And I do live in the city now with a lot, that part of the lot has absolutely no earthworms, and a part of it has 1 or 2 per inch. And I'm trying to understand from who's lived there before and how they lived, why that would be. And of course, I was fascinated by the lecture this morning by David about taking some soilless lot, which many subdivisions create. And I've watched them dig up all the topsoil, all of it, and take it away to sell as topsoil, and then bring in 1 inch and put it back so that maybe some grass will grow. And I think combining what people have said in the couple of days I've been here, like Gwen Olson was saying at summarizing her talk, that we need to educate ourselves, and then we need to get some experience, like you're fixing your backyard, and then we need to become active if we care about all these things. And so when people go through the experience, as we have done in Rockford, Illinois, with a lifestyle change program, and people have a change, it's like some kind of a spiritual experience or some kind of a revelation to them that the world just works differently than they knew. And now they want to know how to engage in this process. And so I loved what we've seen here today. There's people that are starting with their backyard, and they're starting, I think about the years when we put the garbage in the garbage disposal. It was such a convenient new attachment to our kitchen. And we need to put all that garbage back on the garden or in the forest or wherever. And so the leaves that we bag and they carry to the landfill, and the grass that we bag and someone takes it away, all that is precious future soil. And so what I feel as a physician working in lifestyle change is that we need to expand rapidly from learning one thing into its connectivity to everything else, and then pick an area that gives us energy, feeds our passion, and become active in that for the good of the earth. And what's good for the human turns out to be good for the earth. So that's where I end up.
Can I just add to what you just said here? My community, Marin County, California, provides an extra can. They have the waste can, and they have the recycling can, and then they have a green can, and you can put your food waste and your yard waste in it, and they take it away and they compost it, and then they provide free compost and free to all the community members. So if you want to find out about that and have your community do that too, that would be a good step to take.
One more thing, Steve. We have several food deserts in our community where people would have to be on a bus a couple hours in order to get real food with their kids, or with if they're a caregiver for an older person, they'd have to go to. And so we've started community gardens, and the city provides money for people to start community gardens, and they're often taking vacant lots and turning them into producing soil and producing crops, and the people in the neighborhood come and work in the garden, and then they can take the food. And a lot of this going on in Detroit, many other places. Where it's going on so many places, it's hopeful. Planting of trees, so many Arbor Days, it's hopeful, but the job we have to do is so big, it's going to take more of us.
There's also pretty good examples of innovative farmers in all parts of the world who are tackling both the problem of soil erosion and also the problem of maintaining soil fertility. And if you think about maintaining the long-term productive capacity of the land to support societies, we've got to really protect both over the long run. We've got to keep soil on the land where it belongs, but we also have to keep it in a state where it is fertile enough and that fertility is maintained to be able to sustain repeated agricultural production. And throughout history, we have a long history in many parts of the world of essentially mining soil or soil fertility to support a society. And eventually, the sort of clock runs out on that and the resilience of a society gets sapped. So the challenge, I really think, for the next 30, 50, 100 years is to figure out how to develop farming systems for applicable in all the world's economies and climates and soil types that actually regenerate and maintain soil fertility even as we use it to intensively grow crops. And that's a serious challenge, but I think there's farmers who are pointing the way, who are doing that today, that can help point the way forward in terms of where we need to go.
Stephen, can I ask
Sure.
David a question? I often hear about temperatures rising and sea level rising and glaciers melting and climate change, and I think people don't talk about soil as much, soil temperature and soil moisture. Can you speak to what we're going to be losing as this shift is happening?
Well, there's a couple projections that I've seen. One relates just to crop production and rising temperatures, and the rule of thumb that I think I remember is that for every 1 degree C of global temperature rise, the production of key grain crops that we use today, things like wheat, corn, and rice, will drop by 10%. So if you get a 1 degree, you lose 10%, you get 3 degrees, you lose 30% in terms of yields. But that doesn't directly answer your question, which was about soil temperatures and moisture. There's been several years of fairly unusual drought in the American Midwest, for example.
I live in California.
You're in okay. Well, so you're in the kind of the worst of it right now. I used to live there, but then I got a job elsewhere.
Rainy Washington, lucky you.
Yes, yeah, so we're not hurting for water yet. But if you look at some of the farming practices that people have been adopting in the western part of the plains, which have been pretty dry now for a few years in a row, the farmers that are leaving crop stubble on their land and going to no-till methods, and some of them are chemical intensive, some of them are very low chemical use. There's a broad spectrum among no-tillers. But the thing that's in common is that their soil temperatures are lower and their moisture retention is better. They argue that they're keeping an extra 1 to 3 inches of moisture retained in the soil that isn't evaporating out of it. Right. So there's ways that some of the ways that we could adapt our agricultural practices to rebuild soil life and maintain the soil itself may help us with some of those problems. Of course, the best way to help with those problems is to reduce the problem in the first place. Right. The second best way may be to try and figure out creative ways to adapt to it, and the best of those methods may be ones that actually help us build healthier, more fertile soils at the same time. And so there's cautious optimism at ways there.
Okay, so this article might be repeating some of the things you've said, but it's got a strong title, so I want to read it anyway. This is from the Huffington Post Green from December 2014, and its title is, "Topsoil could be gone in 60 years if degradation continues, UN official warns. Generating 3 centimeters of topsoil takes 1,000 years, and if current rates of degradation continue, all of the world's topsoil could be gone within 60 years, a senior UN official said on Friday. About a third of the world's soil has already been degraded, Maria Helena Simodo of the Food and Agricultural Organization told a forum marking World Soil Day. The causes of soil destruction include chemical-heavy farming techniques, deforestation which increases erosion and global warming. The earth under our feet is too often ignored by policymakers, experts say. Soils are the basis of life, said Simodo, FAO's Deputy Director General of Natural Resources. 95% of our food comes from the soil. Unless new approaches are adopted, the global amount of arable and productive land per person in 2050 will be 1/4 of the level in 1960, the FAO reported, due to growing populations and soil degradation. Soil plays a key role in absorbing carbon and filtering water, the FAO reported. Soil destruction creates a vicious cycle in which less carbon is stored, the world gets hotter, and the land is further degraded. We are losing 30 soccer fields of soil every minute, mostly due to intensive farming.
The basic message of that, I think, is true. The broader message is that I think that you'll see that we're not actually literally going to run out of topsoil in the next 60 years. And why would I say that? Because what it's going to mean is that agriculture is going to have to change before we do. If you actually take the rates, David Pimentel back in 1995, 20 years ago, estimated pretty much the same numbers. In fact, that's probably the source for some of those numbers. I used his book, his article for some sources in my book. But if you look at the rate of global soil loss, topsoil loss off of agricultural fields, I think Pimentel estimated we're losing 0.7% a year, something like 23 billion tons, if I'm remembering the numbers right, of soil that's being turned into dirt, being moved out of place. And if you take 0.7% a year, that doesn't sound like a big number until you run the math and go, oh, well, that just means in 150 years it goes down to zero. You would essentially wipe it out. I think the reason why we're not going to literally run out of topsoil is that as our population rises and the amount of arable land decreases, it's going to force changes in farming practices. The real question, I think, is how far ahead we can get of the curve and start restoring land. That 1/3 of global cropland that's been degraded and taken out of agricultural production since the Second World War, much of that could actually be restored with regenerative agricultural practices that could rebuild the soil. And if you look at the numbers for how long it takes to actually, for nature to build an inch of soil, of whether it's 500 years to make an inch or 1,000 years with the FAO estimate, you can compare that to how long does it take people to make soil. Anne made a couple inches in our yard in less than a decade. In other words, nature, as efficient as she is in many regards, isn't necessarily the most efficient builder of soil. We can rebuild topsoil, I think, faster than nature can if we put our mind to it and we develop applications that return a lot of organic matter to the land. That issue of closing the loop on sort of nutrients is hugely important in terms of trying to rebuild soils globally. So I think what this article gets at is that there's a really clear message in terms of the way we're going with agricultural production globally is not a long-term solution. It's going to need to change. And the discussion and arguments we really should be having as a global society are what direction we want it to change in and how to best ensure that we have the fullest agricultural productive capacity in this world that we can 2, 3, 4, 7 generations out. And we're simply not having that discussion at a policy level these days.
You want to go?
The only comment I have is that there is a website called Peak Prosperity by Chris Martinson. And in alternative investments section of that website, and talking about the problem of losing land, there is an investment group in California that is buying up farmland using investors' money, and it takes them 3 years to turn it from conventional farmland into organic farmland. And this whole process is being driven by the demand for organic food. And so things seem like they're changing slowly, then it seems like there's a nidus of change, and before we know it, the whole world is talking about what we were just wondering about. So part of our effort could be to invest in groups that are turning conventional farmland back into soil and converting that to organic farming. There's always something that we can do, even if it's not on the front lines.
So I take a very political point of view on this. There's so much we can do for our own health and for the health of the places where we live, but ultimately we're going to have to change the industrial agricultural system that we have. That's the big destroyer. I mean, it's really necessary, and one of the reasons I think the personal changes are good is that's where we learn what we need, that's where we get committed, but I want to urge everyone to try and make a decision to take that next political step. And the reason is that when you look at the ravages of industrial agriculture, they mostly started after you remember the pictures of the Dust Bowl and the loss of soil, and the government moved in at that point and helped them redo their plowing practices, so to speak, and helped with erosion control and helped control that, although, as I believe, they have never restored and much of that prairie that blew away at that time. And we have this terrible scourge of toxic chemicals that are killing the soil from chemical agriculture. So after the government had that sort of good deed, that was about the last good deed that happened as far as I'm concerned. After World War II, all of the chemicals that were used in the war were turned into toxic pesticides and herbicides and then sold to farmers, and as if that's a good scientific thing to do to raise productivity, all the way up until now, where we have even more toxic technologies also that are affecting the soil as well as our own health. So it's really important to not see this as a separate issue that's out there somewhere and I can protect my health if I just eat healthy, because we're living in a toxic soup. And this is constantly we're drenched in plastics and poisons and these things. We have to take political action. I'm also a Pimentel fan in the sense that he said that our agricultural system is 1 part food calories and 9 parts oil. So I always used to say that, sort of like you just said, that as soon as, peak oil and we run out of fossil fuels, our agriculture is going to have to change too. But, I'm being kind of discouraged about that because I'm seeing this giant squeezing of the last few drops of oil and the last few wonderful soils and stuff to continue the sort of lifestyle that we all have now, or at least this production-based agriculture that we have now. There are real solutions. I gave them all in my talk. And they not only improve the health of ourselves and our communities, but they will make the changes that we need to make in terms of restoring the planet. There is no separation between our personal health and our planetary health.
As I've become interested in ecology and health, as opposed to just health, and health instead of just medicine, I've joined some organizations, and now I will get these phone calls, and they'll say, I want you to vote to know that you could vote against House Bill number so-and-so, and do you have any questions about it? Do you understand it? And so we'll have this conversation, and I've paid my dues to be a member of this organization. So they call, and then she said to me, now your representatives are thus and so, and your senators are thus and so. Would you like me to connect you with them now? And I said, yes. And so all of a sudden, the work of being politically active, if you join the organizations that are doing the political action that you would like to do, it's much easier. On that note, I found the name and number of this organization that some of you might have an interest in. It's Farmland LP, which means limited partnership. Farmland LP Sustainable Organic Conversion. And the website is Craig, C-R-A-I-G, all in capitals, at farmlandlp.com. So there just get to be more and more things we can do and easier to do it.
And that 3 to 5 years to convert from now conventional to organic with roughly the same yields that keeps coming up in study after study that I've seen in people that I've talked to. That seems like a pretty robust thing. And to a geologist, 5 years is nothing. That's no time at all, right? But in the political world, that's forever. It's off the planning horizon. And so I think that the idea of actually trying to motivate change with political activity, making voices known that people want that kind of change is actually very important. Yeah. Because we have opportunities and potential solutions that are kind of within our grasp, but we need social pressure to actually motivate the adoption of it. What we also need, though, frankly, is for it to make a lot of economic sense for individual farmers. And if it made sense for them to convert this year, more of them would start thinking about it. So thinking of ways to sort of bridge the gap, if you will, if we acknowledge that farming is going to change this century, and if we could all agree on what direction, which we might not, but if we could, there's still the question of how do you get farmers to actually engage and start and pull the trigger on that new equipment or that change or trying something different, which is the hardest thing for most people to do on most subjects. And so ways that societally we can help we can subsidize, we can support with our consumer dollars. You know, there's various ways to try and help support that kind of conversion. But I think that's the conceptual and technological part of it. Big pieces of it are already on the table. We're not using all the tools that we may have because we're not unified and trying to know what direction we're going in.
Well, I'll follow up. There's enormous reform in farm subsidy programs, and our farm bill has to change. It's a hugely important part of the problem because we're subsidizing chemical agriculture. GMOs, agriculture would not exist without the farm subsidies that are now in existence. I covered a little bit in our talk, but I want to repeat one part. There have been a lot of experiments on what they call green payments, because farming is a difficult job and you can't always get very good economics out of the situation, partly because of the way we've structured that. But in Europe, for instance, in the Netherlands, they have what they call the yardstick program. So they set targets for the farmers, and they say, if you meet this target that there's no runoff of pesticides in the rivers around you, or you have so many bird nests on your dairy, or they set a conservation target, then the farmer figures out the way to meet those targets, and they get, the yardstick is you get payments. They're called green payments, okay? So they're green subsidies. So there's no reason why we can't have those kinds of conservation subsidies. We had some of them, the Farm Bill activists got some of them done in the recent, not the most recent, but the Farm Bill before that. Unfortunately, the political atmosphere in Congress right now is so conservative and so rigidly about agribusiness that they've withdrawn even the best efforts that we've been able to make, including, reforms to food stamp problems. So they're giving more money to agribusiness and less money even to people in the food stamp programs and social programs and conservation programs. So those are political changes that absolutely, if you need to go, the place to go is the Environmental Working Group. They have a huge EWG.org. They have wonderful explanations of all of this and ways for you to call up your representatives and make your voice known on this. Yeah, EWG, environmentalworkinggroup.org. Thanks. Yeah, go for it.